Hey everyone, and welcome to the Sunny Go One Piece podcast. I am still a little recovering from my cold, so my voice may still sound a little raspy, I guess. But anyways, on this episode, we're going to be diving into episodes 716 through 718, which will cover manga chapters 775 through 777. And here we get to see some grand conclusions to big executive fights, as well as prep for the final big one. Alright, so synopsis. Senor Pink is finally taken down by Frankie, allowing the Tontara to destroy the Smile Factory, while Kyros overcomes Diamante's underhanded techniques as Robin works to protect Rebecca from Diamante's rain of attacks, allowing them to finally find closure for Scarlet's murder. Alright, so differences. There are a handful of differences here. The first one being, during Kyros' fight, it cuts back to Viola commenting on how he's tiring out. This is never in the manga. Another minor change is the anime really milks episode 717 with a full-on retelling of Scarlet's death in its entirety, eating up probably like a good 2.5 minutes that was never in the manga. There's a few more sword clashes between Diamante and Kyros, and Diamante does his half-moon glaive twice instead of just using it once, or I guess attempting to use it once in the manga. At the beginning of episode 718, there are a few more scenes between Luffy and Bellamy that are added that were not in the manga to serve as more filler as well. And then in the anime, we get to see each of Zoro's plans to save everyone from Pika, whereas in the manga, we just hear him kind of explain each one in his head. Or, I know, he's actually saying them out loud, but you don't actually get to see like a visual representation of what they would look like, as like they do in the manga. And then finally, in the anime, they kind of spoil King Isabello's King Punch being kind of a key to Zoro's plan, as in the manga, this wasn't revealed till after Zoro decided on Plan 5, or Tactics 5, I should say. But that's it for all the differences, so let's get into the episodes themselves. And like we left off last episode, we see the conclusion to Senor Pink's flashback and his duel with Frankie, as we saw Russian finally cracked a smile even in her vegetative state, seeing Senor Pink in the bonnet. So from then on, he started dressing more and more like a baby to everyone's shock and ridicule. Even from his crew, as we see everyone like Diamante, Treble, Gladius, and Laoji all kind of make fun of him, but he just doesn't care. And this is where you really see where that kindred spirit between him and Frankie become abundantly apparent, as people around town ridicule him and call Senor Pink a pervert or a hentai, which is something we've seen Frankie very often be subjected to as well. However, both of them, without a care of what society thinks, are very proud of who they are and how they look. And they immediately pick up on this in each other, which is why their duel went the way it did, because they both not only saw the confidence they had in themselves, but that commitment to that despite what everyone else was saying. And that's why Senor Pink never once talked down to Frankie and even pushed back against his gallery of ladies for mocking Frankie, because he knows what it takes to have that kind of strength and mentality, and an important reason why somebody would dress in a way that would invite that kind of ridicule, but to do it in a way that completely owns it. And for Senor Pink, it's worth it to go through all of that just to see Russian smile. And the end of this fight is really emotional and hits you pretty hard. And while Senor Pink is certainly not a good man, like I discussed in the last episode, he's not quite outright evil either, in my opinion. I can't even really say he was misguided. He was a very flawed and bad person that had some redeeming qualities. And for me, though, what really sells this is his connection and kindred spirit with Frankie. They both seem to realize that they have more in common than not. Frankie has made his fair share of mistakes in his life, and even started the series, his debut as a sort of villain, but Frankie luckily had his family, and in particular Tom, who showed him the right way to deal with life. But Senor Pink unfortunately ended up with Doflamingo. And so when Senor Pink is finally knocked out and he's crying, you do kind of feel bad for him a little bit. And it was a nice touch of Frankie wiping away his tears before anyone can see him to keep his hard-boiled reputation intact. Especially since in another life, they probably could have been really good friends considering how similar they are, with Frankie even saying that maybe someday they can grab a drink and have him tell him about Russian. And one cool thing is that much later on in chapter 1021, in response to a reader request, Oda actually drew this hypothetical Elseworld scene of Senor Pink and Frankie at a bar having a drink, as Frankie bawls his eyes out at the story we all just witnessed. And they're both drinking what looks like a gimlet, which is obviously the drink that his son was named after. And I'm assuming Russian was also named after the cocktail, a white Russian. And this is one of the few non-canon fan request covers that Oda has drawn that I hope someday does become canon somewhere down the line, even if it's at the very end of the story in a sort of an epilogue type of thing. From there, Frankie leads the Tontada into the factory to destroy the factory, now that there's no one left, and Frankie just passes out from exhaustion. Like, he toughed it out for sure. But yeah, this took a lot out of him. But this then brings us back to the other main fight going on with Diamante up in the Flower Garden with the former and true champion of the Colosseum versus the false champion. And one fun thing right off the bat is that in the manga, when Diamante uses the half moon glaive, the speech bubble is actually cut in half into essentially two halves of a moon, where the word half or han is in one half and the word moon or getsu is in the other half. And I found this to be a really fun little touch that Oda included in the manga that obviously would not be able to be represented in the anime. But yeah, if you ever read the manga, I like how Oda does this sometimes. Diamante has so many underhanded ways of using what I at first thought was a ridiculously weak power. But he, and I mean by he, I mean both he and Diamante and Oda, utilize these powers in pretty terrifying ways by constantly pulling pieces of paper or cloth out and then morphing them back into their solid state, like the mortars that shoot out the spiked balls to rain down on his opponents. Referring to it as the Death Enjambre, Robin uses her powers to grab a bunch of sunflowers and creates an umbrella of flowers shielding Rebecca and herself, which is pretty cool, because it not only meshes with her powers, but she actually uses a physical flowers, so it's like flower fruit. Anyways, Kyros is able to protect himself, but Diamante, with another annoying underhanded tactic, shoots Kyros in the leg with a gun, bringing him to his knees, and then forcing him to take the brunt of those spiked ball attacks. And I have to say, Megumi Hayashibara really shows why she is a legend in the anime voice acting industry, because her screams of anger here are so good, and the performance even feels a little bit above what even One Piece usually has. However, in an insane effort, Kyros manages to get up and just continues to tank all the spiked balls raining down on him. And there's this really emotional moment between Kyros and Rebecca where he reminds him that her mother's kindness and spirit still lives on in Rebecca's pure hands that have yet to harm people, despite continuously fighting in the Colosseum for years. And Oda really loves his sort of father-daughter relationships, especially around this time, since, as I've mentioned in the past, that around this time is when he had his kids, and I think it really starts to shine through in his writing when he starts really focusing on those. Once Kyros gets his second wind and begins to charge at Diamante, you can really tell what kind of fighter Diamante really is. And he is one of those fighters that has essentially been too reliant on his powers. And this is a theme that you'll see pretty much with all of the Don Quixote family fighters, especially with Pika as well. And they always create fights where, you know, Diamante has had the advantage due to underhanded techniques. And the way he just freaks out at Kyros' determination in each attack is evidence that he just cannot deal with someone that can actually overpower him. And when he finally lands that finishing blow, the Treno Bastardo attack, it is very satisfying. And I mentioned at the start of this fight that I always felt like this fight, you didn't quite hate Diamante enough for it to feel meaningful. And while that is still true, I do feel like Oda does his best to infuse all of those emotions within this fight instead of the lead up like he usually does. But yeah, you have these little moments where our disdain for Diamante slowly grows, and by the end of it, it does still feel very satisfying. But I feel like a lot of that feeling came not necessarily from Diamante himself, but just the collective pain we all feel from the royal family's perspective. It's also an incredibly beautiful touch that it was Scarlet's grave that was the final hit to finish him off in the back of the head. And it's really touching that both Scarlet and Kyros together were able to protect and save their precious daughter and their home. And as touching as Rebecca's reunion with her father at Scarlet's grave is, I always tear up a bit when it's revealed that Robin used her body to shield Rebecca completely from the spiked balls when the flower umbrella started to fail. And when you see her back is completely shredded and bloody, yet Robin has a big smile on her face, it really gets you. You just know how much this meant to Robin and how much her past has to be, weighing on her, knowing just how good and kind of a person Robin actually is. This isn't something that's often highlighted by Oda, but Robin has done some awful things that we've seen, as well as several things that we probably aren't even aware of. But that guilt she's probably shouldering because of that has to no doubt be overwhelming. And this also, I think, is another reason why she felt like she didn't deserve to live all those years back, and Luffy had to convince her. Like, how do you forgive yourself for doing something like helping create a civil war that cost the lives of thousands of people in Arabasta and hurt so many people? Even if it was to survive, I think Robin will always carry a little bit of that guilt with her, which is why I think it's so important, to the point where she was willing to sacrifice her own life potentially to protect Rebecca. And she made sure that Rebecca wouldn't know and feel any guilt as well in the process. And I get pretty emotional knowing that Robin got a little solace here, knowing she was able to atone even for a little bit for what she put Vivi and Cobra through. And it's a really beautiful and understated moment for Robin. That's why it never bothered me one bit, like it does some fans, that Robin didn't get like this huge 1v1 fight in this arc, because this was infinitely more meaningful and more powerful for her character. It's just absolutely perfect. Now that fight's over, we move to Viola, who breaks down the situation in a very much hype-building fashion of what's left ahead of them now that Diamante has gone down. And it all comes down to Bellamy, Pika, Treble, and Doflamingo himself. And King Riku decides to head down into the city to help. And it's also revealed that Fujitoro left a little while ago as well. And we learn that, seeing where things are headed, he has decided to have his men gather all the remaining citizens in one place so that they can create a protective perimeter around them, so that the other warriors and the Straw Hats can concentrate on taking down the Don Quixote family. And we'll talk more about this in the next episode. But yeah, I like what Fujitoro is doing here. And this then brings us back to one more major fight remaining outside of the big guys at the palace, and that is Zoro versus Pika. And just like all the other Don Quixote executives, Pika has no intention of fighting fairly or squarely, as he decides to just straight up run up to the top executives and face down Kyros, Rebecca, and Robin, as well as all the other injured and downed fighters. And you begin to realize that while they do have powerful fruits, they're all incredibly underhanded, weak-willed, and cowards after watching the fight. And I think the only potential exception to this would be Dellinger, but that's because I think he's legitimately like a psychotic person due to his fighting fish genetics. And of course, Senor Pink, whose life is defined by approaching it head-on and with a hard-boiled mentality. But outside of those two, like, it seems like every one of their other fighters are just incredibly underhanded. I mean, you saw Gladius basically try and create these like unwinnable situations. Lao Ji just attacking just random people. Like, it's pretty bad. I mean, if you look at all their fights, they all use incredibly dirty tricks and underhanded strategies, like running and hiding, then attacking from the shadows, or taking hostages, or attacking the weak, as well as creating unfair advantages by cheating, essentially. And watching Pika is especially frustrating because you know that Zoro is way stronger than this guy. And if he just stopped running and faced Zoro, he'd end him in an instant, because Pika's power is so overwhelmingly versatile. It allows him to just keep prolonging the fight by hiding and causing a lot of casualties along the way. And because he's starting to sense this, he returns to his massive giant stone form, and instead of fighting Zoro, he goes up for Usopp and Riku, as well as everybody left on the King's Plateau, leaving Zoro with very few options to return in time to save them all. And I love that in this moment, we see Zoro chasing after Pika. We see him actually try and think of different plans. Like, we get inside Zoro's head for once, and what he plans to do to try and save everyone. And we often think of Zoro being sort of this muscle-bound jock type that just brute forces his way through everything. But it shows here that Zoro can be very cerebral and patient when it comes to combat. Seeing what he has at his disposal, he settles on his fifth plan to fly through the air and cut Pika down, whatever that means at this point. Now, Zoro seemingly has a plan to deal with Pika, or at the very least, an idea of how to catch up to him and save everyone on the King's Plateau, including Usopp, Kinemon, Kanjuro, and everyone else. But will it work? And unfortunately, we will have to wait till the next podcast episode to talk about that, because that's where the episode ends, unfortunately. But yeah, this is a really cool cliffhanger, and it'll be fun to really talk about this in the next episode. But I know this is a shorter episode, but yeah, my voice is still not quite recovered, so sorry about that. But this is where we'll have to end this one. But if you did enjoy this, send me a like or comment. And if you'd like to join me on this journey of rewatching One Piece, please consider subscribing. Check out my Instagram at SunnyGoPodcast if you want updates of when I post new episodes, or to see some pictures of my manga collection. And yeah, again, like I always say, just listening to the podcast is enough for me. And as always, I wanted to thank you for taking the time out to listen to it. Stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the next episode. Bye.